where do you think your life would be now if you hadn't taken the decision to make that transition? If you hadn't had the courage to say, I'm quitting my job and I'm selling my house and getting out of California, where do you think your life would be now if you hadn't had the courage to make that decision on transition?
My best guess is I would either be dead, disabled, or barely functional.
Wow. Wow. I'm Art Blanchford, and this is Life in Transition, a podcast about making the most of the changes we're given. As a married father of 3 teenagers, a longtime global business executive and adventurer, I've been through hundreds of transitions in my life. Many have been difficult, but all have led to a depth and richness I could never have imagined. You'll get to hear all about them on this podcast so that together we can create more love and joy in our lives, no matter what transitions we are going through. Hello, everybody. We're back with Art Blanchford with Life in Transition, and I'm really, really excited today to have my first guest. Whether it'll be launched as the first guest or not, I don't know yet, but I'm interviewing now my first guest on Life in Transition, and it's from a man who I love dearly, who's super close to me as a brother. From another mother, grew up in our house, cousins, but almost in the same month, but the same age, and we've been through everything in life together. And specifically, the reason I wanted to have him as my first guest is because he started going through this major transition a little bit ahead of me and was really a guide and a help for me as I started going through this, quitting the big professional job and starting on to the second half of my life. So without further ado, please welcome to the podcast, to Life in Transition, the one and only Jim Hunt. I'm so glad you're here, Jim. It's really good to be with you. And thanks for being willing to be my first guest on this podcast.
Thank you, Art. It is a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I have not yet been a guest on a podcast, and I'm happy that you also are the first podcast for me.
Oh, cool. I hadn't thought about that. I've been on a couple, but this is really interesting. And I guess I just want to start I gave a little bit of background in the intro, but a little bit of your story, like just a little bit about your life and what led you to this major transition for you, and when that was, and just a little bit of your story. What brought you to sitting here behind the microphone with me right now?
Yeah, well, as you well know, it's a very long and complex story. However, I'll do my best to summarize briefly. I grew up feeling that I had a long journey from barely getting by and looking out for myself, taking care of myself. You and I both started our jobs working in the workforce early in life, and largely being self-sufficient. And I carried that through like following a prescription or a checklist in life to take my opportunities and go as far as I could with them the way I thought I was supposed to be a success.
I think that many of us have this checklist. What were the things on your checklist, Jim? What were the things that you thought that you needed to go bing, 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 bing to have a successful life?
Well, I thought I needed to have a professional, high-paying job. Now, bear in mind, high-paying in that context of when we were children is very different than I might see it today. But I wanted to have a professional, secure, sought-after type of career and job. I wanted to marry and have a family. I wanted to have my own home, not just renting from people, things like that. I wanted to, as funny as it may sound right now, we're both over 50, I wanted to have a reliable car. That was high on my list. One that wouldn't be breaking down by the side of the road at the most inconvenient of times. So that's what I went forward with. And I guess when I had a lot of those things, all of those things I just mentioned, it occurred to me as a child came into the picture that I wanted to make sure that my child had a father in the picture which I did not experience and I
Right.
always wished for. And so I set my considerable will to sticking out whatever challenges came my way to make sure that my child grew up in a two-parent family. And in hindsight, that might not have been the best thing for
Interesting.
him, for my son, or for me.
So, so tell me
Please go
about
ahead.
that. Tell me about that. So you had this checklist that I think many of us grew up with, right? Get education so we can have a professional
Yes,
job, primarily to have the money to be able to have a reliable car and a home and a family and, sort of tick the boxes of the American dream.
right.
And you got those. You're living in California. You had the family. You had the house,
Yes,
beautiful house that you designed yourself.
yes.
Um, what happened? What did what happened? What triggered the wake up or the change or the how did you know that you needed to make a big transition? Like what was going on in your life that led you to realize that you needed to transition to something different?
Well, as part of my goals to be a father to my child and everything, I had kind of made exploration of divorce or going separate road with my wife at the time not an okay topic to explore, even within
Mm,
myself.
mm. So that
Um,
was something that was just off limits, like
it
nothing.
was off limits unless an evaluation of the house that we lived in together came back as deeply toxic or damaging. Um,
Okay, for
and
your
it,
for
and
yourself,
for,
for your
for
son,
my son,
for
for
your
my son,
son, for your
I was
son.
willing
Okay,
to, I was willing to and intended to endure
right,
regardless. And while things were stressful in our home at times, they were not terrible.
right.
And so I never ventured into the space of considering a major transition. What triggered beginning of my transition was a slow bubbling up of the idea that I was miserable.
Mm.
I hadn't really even considered the idea of my level of happiness.
So this
However,
whole time on your checklist, there was nothing about your own happiness or fulfillment. It was
that is
checking the
correct.
box and then taking responsibility for your obligations of being a good father that you didn't have.
Correct. At this point in my life,
Right, right.
leading up to this shift. So, what I set out to do, I said, okay, well, let me make a list of things that I'd like to do that I find enjoyment, that I get joy from. And I went to my office in my house and I sat down by myself with a blank sheet of paper and a pen. And that paper stayed blank. I could not think of a single thing that would bring me joy or happiness.
Wow. So
I get a little teary even now, just thinking
wow.
back to that moment.
Wow. And I have to interject a little bit here because just for our listeners, I never knew this. And Jim and I are super close and we share everything and we love each other and support each other. And I never knew this. So when was this, Jim? What was the time? What was how old were you? How old was your son? This was your house in California. You were working in
Yes,
Cadence.
yes. This was in 2018, just a month or two before my son graduated high school.
Okay. Okay. And just to give a little bit of background too, for some of you maybe computer nerds, like Jim is a really smart guy too, went to Carnegie Mellon, computer engineer, and grew up through the ranks in West Coast software industry. So nothing, there's a full on professional life going on with this guy as well at this time. On the outside, to me and probably to most of Americans, it would have looked like, or most people would have looked like sort of the idyllic life, right? You pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, and here you are living this, I'll call it the Facebook life, not that you're on Facebook, but the outside of your life that you hit the check boxes, you had the house, you had the wife, you had the child, had a good job, doing well. And yet you're sitting here and you can't think of one thing to write down that would bring you joy.
Yes, not a single thing.
Wow.
I sat there for a good 15 minutes trying to come up
Wow.
with something. Yes, that was the first major realization or crack in the facade where I felt I became consciously aware that this is not okay.
Wow.
Now, bearing in mind at the time, I had a child struggling through the American public high school uh, condition that we have now, and not fun for him, not fun for parents. A teenager uh, pushing himself away to establish his own independence.
Sure.
A marriage that definitely had its challenges. There was lots of love and still is between us, even though we're divorced for years now, a few years now. Um, and that doesn't make a marriage alone just
Right.
because you love someone.
Right.
Um, and and I was running three teams of engineers in two U.S. geographical locations and one in India. So I was often putting in 14 plus hour days in
Wow.
to my attempt to be a good boss for everyone reporting to me. So there was a lot going on with me. This didn't just happen in isolation. There was a lot of demands on myself that were distracting, that pulled me away from thinking about my own needs.
Right.
Um,
Right.
but that day when I sat down to write down things that would be fun or help me experience joy was a defining moment.
And that was, you said that was 19. So spring of 19.
Uh, 18.
18. So coming on 5 years ago, 4.5 years ago from now.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. First of all, too, I want to say, I'm sorry that you were in that place. I did not know. And that's pretty heavy, right? To be in that place where you can't find anything that brings you joy. And I'm really sorry that you were in that place. And I'm, so excited to see your life now, which I won't say more than that. I'll let you do that, but I'm so excited to see your life now. So that was the start of the transition. So tell a little bit
Yes.
more, like how did it progress from there? Like how did you make your decisions? How did, like you made some really big changes, right?
I did.
And how did you decide that? How did you know what was right? How did these are big things. I mean, you're still a young guy, right? 51 years old. So back then you were whatever it was, 47, right?
Yes. Um, so from there, I kind of thought, well, I didn't feel deeply depressed or anything. I just didn't have happiness in my life. So I fell back on the trick of fake it till you make it. I was like, well, there were things I wanted to do when I was younger. I wanted
Right.
to go hang gliding. I wanted to ride a jet ski. I
Right.
wanted to ride a motorcycle through the woods, off-roading. Um, some things like that. I wanted to go surfing. Um, so I started to write down things that I used to want to do
Okay.
that maybe I never got to. And I actually did one of them. I did a hang gliding lesson and spent a whole afternoon doing that. And it's hard to describe now that experience. I didn't feel it connected me with joy in a tangible way. And yet it was kind of fun. It was kind of fun.
Right.
So it was a good step. But then I was left with, well, where do I go from here? Now, the next big change was, I have to back up a little. At that time, for the past 5 years or so, every summer I would go to my mom's farm in Indiana
Yep.
for anywhere from 1 to 2.5 weeks with my son. And he got to experience a non-urban life for a bit. And
Right.
I got to, yeah, and I got to work on the farm and sweat in the sun and decompress. And
Right.
I would take vacation time, but if there were critical work meetings, I would log in remotely.
Right.
I was kind of an early adopter to virtual and remote
Right.
work. Um, and that last year, also in 2018, my son, who is now, 18-year-old independent teenager, at least he thought so.
Right. Right.
um, he said, nope, I'm not going with you. I'm not going to go to Indiana. I don't want to just be bored on the farm for a couple of weeks. And, I talked to him about it. I gave him time to reconsider, but he would not budge.
Right.
So then I'm left with, well, what about me? I need this time to reconnect with nature and hear the wind instead of the traffic.
And how long, Jim, just to pause you right there. I noticed you said, what about me? And that's clearly something a question you hadn't asked for most of your adult life.
That's right.
Was that the first time that you asked that question in a long time, or was that coming? Like, I just noticed that's very different than you saying, I'm just going to do my obligations,
yes,
checking the box, right?
That's very astute of you to pick that up. I yes, this is right now. I haven't thought about that, but my best guess is that is the first time I ever thought, what about me?
Wow.
In a very long time.
Wow. And so many of us, we think to ask about ourselves is like to be selfish, right?
Yeah.
But the fact is that we can't do anything for anybody else if we aren't taken care of.
Right. So as you know, and as many who know me know, I'm not a very kind of dyed in the wool church kind of a religious kind of fellow. Sure. Although I have a strong spiritual streak within me, I tend to not like quote scripture and whatnot.
Sure.
However, I have read all of the Old Testament and some of the New Testament, and out of all of that reading, I believe there's the one thing that comes into my head that I don't know, that I can think back over time. It just keeps showing up is where Jesus says, remove the log from your own eye before you can help me remove the speck from my own. Now that's a paraphrase, not a quote, but the intent of it has stuck with me.
Right.
And I'm a big believer in that. And I have fallen back on that in my journey through healing my codependency and all of this. So yeah, I mean, I love helping others. It's deeply part of who I am. And
sure.
I was really a mess.
Right.
I didn't know it, but I was a real mess.
So let's talk about that for a minute. Like, I think about specifically your physical health. Like, what was going on in your physical well-being during those years? Just to get some idea of where you were, because that was maybe normal, but it was still pretty profound, even if it's normal in America today to not be healthy.
Yeah, that's a good point. That was a big part of this existence and has been a big part of my transition as well. I, as you know, have had migraine headaches since I was a toddler, since my earliest memories. Now, they have occasionally disappeared for a few months and come back. And they've been worse at times and not so bad at times, but they've always been present. In my professional career, within a couple of years after I graduated college, my migraine headaches started to become more intense and last longer. And that progression continued for a couple decades, maybe, before I started to get a handle on that.
So for 20 years, up to about the time when you were having these questions, your migraines were getting more severe and more debilitating and more frequent.
Yes, they were. And to the point, at its very worst, I would get 2 to 3 migraines a week.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
I mean, because your migraine sometimes could take a couple of days to get over.
Well, that was the next statement, is the worst of them would last 3 to 3.5 days. So a day when I was not in pain was a good day. Most days I was either in pain or at some low level of pain.
Wow. And this had been building for 20 years, you said?
Yes. And that's when I started to seriously reevaluate everything with respect to migraines.
Mm-hmm.
I was recommended an excellent book called Heal Your Headache by my neurologist. He actually loaned me his copy. He said, Jim, you're the most analytical and careful, and you track more data about your migraine and everything than any of my other patients. So I found this book useful. Here, you can borrow mine.
And what did you learn from it?
I learned a lot about I guess I don't think the book calls them this, but I'll call them micro triggers for
Right.
migraine,
Right.
where I think in the book, this is an excellent analogy. It's like every time you eat or drink a micro trigger, it's like filling a glass with water. And if you pour enough little bits into that glass, it overflows, and that overflowing glass represents a migraine.
Okay. Okay.
Which this does explain a lot of the mystery around why some people get migraines out of nowhere or seemingly out of nowhere, even though most migraineurs have an awareness of at least their strong triggers.
Right. But if you have a
As I
micro
did.
trigger that was the straw that broke the camel's back,
That's right.
then
That's
you
right.
don't know what it
Exactly.
is even, and you could still get a
Right.
migraine.
Yes. And the other thing I found is what I would eat would have an effect on my risk of migraine for up to 3 days.
Oh, wow. So quite a
And
delayed reaction as well.
yes, and interestingly, day one was high risk, day two was a little lower, and day three was about as high as day one.
Interesting. Yeah, there's probably not a lot of people that have enough self-awareness or detail and data analysis to even know that for themselves.
Well,
right.
I'm a very analytical person and a deep thinker, and I have sweated out every possibility and run through every simulation that I could think of or that I learned from others.
So what were some of the things that migraines kept you from doing in your life at this time?
They kept me from being active, which
So
had a
physically active.
cascading effect. That's correct. For the earlier part of my career in California, I would a few times a week at lunch go play volleyball with others, go play basketball. And after a while, I became aware of a pattern. Every time I would go and be physically active like that night or late afternoon, an intense, powerful migraine would hit me.
Wow. So something that's supposed to be so good for you was actually a major
Yes,
trigger for
yes,
migraines, which would be
yes,
debilitating.
yes. And at the time, I just accepted it at face value and I decided to stop exercising because the the pain isn't the only price I was paying. Every time I would get a migraine, I would take ibuprofen, caffeine, and for bad migraines, I would take hydrocodone, and I tried various other daily preventative prescription medications as well. So all of and various triptans, I tried those too. So all of these drugs come with side effects,
Right.
and avoiding migraine by not exercising, in my evaluation, became preferable. Like the negative effects of not exercising became preferable to the negative effects of all the side effects, plus the pain.
Right. So how
And that
long, Jim?
actually that worked for me in a fashion. After a fashion, it reduced my migraines incidence for about a decade.
So you went a decade or more without exercising?
That is correct.
Wow.
Yes, I did.
Wow.
Yes, and and the other end of that is that I at some point said the effects of not exercising after that length of time became debilitating as well
Right.
to my cognitive function, to my physical function, and my sleep. So I reversed course. I said, I'm going to double down on the medications and take them before things get bad, but I have to exercise.
Right. So was
And
it 10 years you didn't exercise, or 12 or 15? Do you roughly know?
it was at least 10. It
Okay.
might have been it wasn't more than 12.
Okay. Okay. But that's a long time, right? Especially
Oh,
as we
yes.
age, right?
Oh, yes.
You do that from
Oh,
10 to
yes.
22, maybe you can get away with it, but from 30 to 45 might not be such a good idea.
Right. But this intent and desire to reintegrate activity into my life kind of coincided with this first big change. Like a friend of mine at work asked me to go on a 5K run with him, which now seems like nothing, but at the time, man, that was hard because
Right.
I hadn't done anything in a long time.
Right.
And that was also in 2018.
Wow. So just 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, it
So
was like a
so
little over
just to
four
give a
years.
little bit of perspective, you said now it's nothing. So maybe do a little snapshot of where you are now. Like, what's your life like
Okay.
today? And then we can fill in some of the gaps, because I definitely, there's a lot to your story that I'd like to hear, but
Okay.
what's your life look like today?
before I say that, let me just add that part of my life transition dealt with, you know, I don't want to steal the punchline, but yeah, I left my career behind. I left California behind,
Yeah.
moved back to Tennessee eventually. I left my marriage behind,
Yeah.
and I embarked on a gym first protocol, as in, even if my mom needs my help with something, if I'm exhausted and I need to rest, I'm going to rest.
Right.
If I
Right.
feel like a little headachy, I'm going to take an ibuprofen and relax.
Right.
Even though there's a job, there's this home, some home repair or something that I was planning to do, or I would call and cancel if there's somebody I was going to meet. Like, I made this the priority, and physical activity and diet, rest, diet, physical activity, and also a whole lot of time, countless hours of podcasts, videos, books about relationships and healing and migraines and all of it.
Right.
That became my life.
So it's
So
interesting, Jim, because sorry to interrupt here, but when I hear you say I went on a gym first campaign, even me knowing your story and me being through a similar story, it still like makes me think, that's sort of selfish. Like, that's not, I mean, I still feel that little reaction in myself right now.
yeah,
And I imagine a lot of listeners will feel that way as well, but it's absolutely necessary. I wanted to emphasize that because I just think it's so important. Like, so much of our culture is about, you
yes,
know, external achievements, as well as, seeming like we're not being selfish and taking care of others. It's even, I think, more so in general with women than it is with men, that they give, 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 give. And I want to say again that it's not possible to give what you don't have. If you don't have rest, if you don't have life,
that's right.
love, if you don't have life, you can't give it. If you don't have, you have to have it in order to give it. I was at Graceland last year for the first time. Elvis's home in Memphis. And
Yeah,
you know what it said on his grave, written by his dad?
no, I don't.
Elvis needed rest, so God took him home. Like, he'd been going so hard, right? And dragging himself up to go and go and
Yeah,
go. And his handlers and stuff, they just go and giving, 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 giving,
yes.
that he didn't even
Well,
have life to give anymore. In order for him to rest, he had to die,
I
according to
don't
his
know if
dad's
everybody,
eulogy or epitaph.
I don't know if everybody really gets that epitaph, but I know that you and I do.
Yeah, exactly. So I just want to encourage you, if you're feeling that you can't take a rest, that you can't take care of yourself, not only you can, you must, or else the people that you're trying to take care of in your life won't have any of you left.
That's
So
correct. That's
have the
right.
courage, have the audacity, have the love of self to take care of yourself.
If each of us is a shining star, we have to spend time re, recharging, adding energy to ourselves so we can continue to shine.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really true.
So you asked where I am now, and I just want to say one more thing before getting to that.
Sure.
Sorry, I keep deviating a little, but things come up. Um, in the middle of 2019, I was on the Daily Ohm site,
Yep.
and I was on their mailing list, and they sent me a course called Codependent to Independent. And I took that course. It's a self-paced course. It's like 30 lessons, 30 days. It took me about 3.5, 4 months to get through it
Okay.
because I didn't push or force or rush.
Right.
I
Good for you.
waited. I set the intention and made it important and waited until I was ready for the next lesson each time. And I will never forget, at that time, I was still living close to my mom's farm in Indiana. And there was one time my mom called me up. She needed help with something.
Right.
And I checked in with myself. Well, I should say, I didn't really know how to do that yet. I felt the visceral reaction in the pit of my stomach that said no. And this time, for the first time, I'd paid attention.
Right.
Maybe in
So
my life.
that you
First time
listened
I
in
caught,
this,
yeah,
that this still voice that you knew was right, but you wouldn't listen to before, you would override it
yes,
with analysis or whatever, what you should do, or I know
Yes.
that's one of your favorite words.
I like to say, as you know, there is no should.
Right.
Um, so that is the first time that I consciously became aware of this message from myself and honored it. And I said, I'm sorry, Mom. I can't today. I'll help you tomorrow if you still need my help then.
Right. And what did that feel like? I mean, to have the courage to say that, and how did that feel?
Felt a little guilty. I felt
Mm,
bad. I felt
yeah.
selfish. You know,
Yeah.
my mom is getting on in years and she works very hard. And yeah, it didn't feel good in from a conscious sense. And yet from a heart sense, a gut sense, it felt awesome.
Right.
Just it felt great, really.
Right. Right.
Um, I was like, I chalked it up as a major win. And this was, by the way, the first interactive application of the concepts I learned from that course, Codependent to
Right.
Independent.
Right.
So that's why I mentioned it. I wanted to mention that. Now, if you would still like to have me say a little about where I am today, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so as I mentioned before, I live in Tennessee again, and I actually, ever since I graduated college, I really did want to come back home to Tennessee. So I feel good about that because I lived a few places in between California and Tennessee. Um, I regularly go for runs and walks and hikes, and there's a lot of time among natural beauty. I have a really awesome relationship with a wonderful, brilliant lady who lives in the same town, and I'm, I still can't believe that sometimes. Sometimes it just hits me, and I just feel this bursting out of love from my heart for her, for my life, for this situation. I have my own house. It's not a mansion. It's modest, but it's mine, and I get to work on it and my intelligence and ability into making it better. And I'm volunteering, and I don't know. I'm reconnecting with friends better. Our relationship, you and I,
Yeah.
we've been a lot more interactive. And frankly, in my old life, I wouldn't have been available to help you the way, you know, I say help you. It's been mutual. Make no mistake.
Yeah,
You
for
you
sure. But I
definitely
mean,
inspire me too.
but dude, in the beginning, I mean, when you were, when you were down the transition path a year or more, when I was still thinking about mine, that was really and stressing about mine, I would say that was really super helpful. I mean, the COVID was such a gift for me. I know it was very
Yes.
tough on a lot of people. It was horrible, and for me to stop the travel and to come home and sit, and the fact that you spent a lot of time here with us during COVID,
Right.
and really helped me to see, that the situation I was in at work wasn't healthy, and
Yes.
being
Yes.
gaslit,
Hmm.
and that somehow that I could make it. I was so afraid that I couldn't
Yes.
make it without that job, and somehow having your presence and the time, like you said. And still, I feel so lucky, to have someone else in my life that's fit and my age that has time to play and that has time to do things, to come spend time in
Yes.
New Mexico like we did together, and go
Yes.
hiking. And I value that I have that time now as well. Maybe not
I
quite to the
value
same extent, but it's really,
I value that you have that time
it's really
because
great.
it's allowed us to reconnect in a powerful way. One thing you mentioned there brought up a memory of a couple of times when you were talking is the final straw for me that really launched the biggest changes in my life back in 2018 was an acknowledgement that things were so dysfunctional for me personally
In what areas,
that
Jim? Dysfunctional work, family, location, health? What areas specifically when you say dysfunctional?
I couldn't narrow it down that way.
Okay.
I just knew my life was not working for me.
Okay.
So that's when it got it got to the point where I acknowledged to myself that I would rather give up everything, my house, any savings, my marriage, my job, that I would rather lose all of that and start over from scratch, even if it meant bagging groceries at the grocery store. It was that powerful that
So,
and that's what it took. Anything less, I would not have made the shift because it's terrifying.
right,
I was
right,
terrified. And it was so painful too to hurt people that I cared so deeply about. My ex-wife, for example, my son didn't understand. My coworkers, some of, I mean, not to toot my own horn, I would think I was a pretty good boss, and there were tears shed when I left by people who reported to me. People who've connected with me on LinkedIn since then have expressed they wish they could find another boss like me. So I
sure,
feel
yeah,
it's very, very validating. I feel very good
yeah.
about that. I managed to do some things pretty well in the face of such dysfunction.
But you got to a point where your life was continuing, it wasn't an option. It was totally
That's right.
like it was worse. Your current status was worse than your fears of the worst case if you made the change.
That's correct. Yes, I, I just knew I didn't see it. That's what I was saying. I can't pin it down to exactly what was not going well. I couldn't tell. I couldn't see it. It was all murky and dark. I just knew that this life that I had was completely broken.
Right.
And so I had to give it up. I couldn't say, well, maybe if I just quit my job, maybe I get a new
Right.
job somewhere else. That was not going to cut it.
So at
I
that point,
needed,
you had a realization that you needed to give up your all the external trappings of your life. I mean, all of them at the same time. Is that the realization that
yes,
you had at that point?
pretty much. I mean,
So did you knew at that point that you were going to quit your job?
yes,
Did you also know that you were going to get divorced at that point?
there was a bit of a slower transition there. I did intend to quit my job
And did you
and
know
leave
you were going to
California.
move and leave California? So those two things. So two of the three big ones. You knew you were going to quit your job and you knew you were going to sell your home and leave California.
Yes,
In the time you were
and
thinking about maybe going to Texas if you were going to stay
that's
there.
right.
Okay.
I was going to move to Austin. We were going to move to Austin,
Right.
Texas,
Right.
and try to pick up and make a new life there. And that happened in the discussions throughout 2018. But in September, when I came to the realization that I needed to ask for a divorce, that was another step in my journey where I was waking up and remembering what I had sacrificed. And I realized my marriage was not remotely like a relationship that I needed and desired to have.
Right. And
I
deserve to
also,
have, I would say.
yes, yeah, I think we all deserve
Yeah.
to have a
Yeah.
supportive, loving relationship that we feel good about. Um,
So the point that the breaking point, this was still in 2018, was just when you got to the
yes,
point where you realized that the life you were living was worse than your worst nightmare of losing your job and your house in California and so forth.
yes,
And therefore there was no trade-off. It was just stop and then see what comes because it's worse
yes.
than what you.
That's a good way of describing it. Stop and see what comes. I didn't know what was coming. I didn't even know where I was going to go when I started that massive transition.
So I know you're not officially in a 12-step recovery program like I am, but I have this book which very well used. But that's step
Yes,
one, right? We admitted that we were powerless over our life, that our lives had become unmanageable, right? That it was unmanageable to go forward.
right.
And then you knew that really clearly and decided at that moment to make two big changes. So at the point when you decide, okay, I'm definitely quitting my job and I'm definitely moving out of California, two big transitions at the same time.
Yes.
How long did it take you to act on that? So that was a decision point. And then how long before
Hmm.
you could unwind yourself in I don't know what you say, a reasonable way or a professional way, or I don't know, the right way for you? How long did it take you to act on those decisions?
Well, it was almost like a building wave, I guess. There, my ex-wife and I had discussions about leaving California and moving with a target of the beginning of 2018. So this was before I started to wake up a bit more.
Right.
But
Right.
this was like the rumblings of a volcano that is going to eventually erupt. So when life circumstances prevented her from being ready to make that transition, I felt like that was kind of, in some ways, the straw that broke the camel's back.
For your marriage at that point.
It, it was definitely not that big a deal in isolation. However, our marriage was struggling.
Had been for a long time.
Had been for a long time, yes. And as part of my decision to divorce, I did very carefully and seriously. I did my best to evaluate if we could salvage our marriage, and the thinking at the time, and even in hindsight, is maybe I might have been able to. However, in my dysfunctional and weakened state of who I am and who I was, I didn't feel like I had the wherewithal within me to pursue, to invest all that effort on a baby.
Right. Right. So you were starting to have a sense of needing to know what your limits were, right? And
Yes.
where you need to take care of yourself before you could do anything else.
Yes. And eventually when I almost didn't have the courage, but I did somehow manage to get it out to ask for divorce and go through that process, which was, I'm trying to think of adjectives to describe how painful that was, and I'm having a hard time. It was just horribly, horribly painful. Like going into the garage, into my car, shutting the door, and screaming painful.
I'm sorry.
I had to do that a few times. But yeah, I'm sorry too. And I recognize that all of that discomfort, all of that pain, I had to get to that level in my life before I would have had the courage and the will to go that route. I mean,
right.
I did not want to hurt people. And I just had to.
And so you were hurting yourself because you didn't want to hurt others.
I was sacrificing my own life in the very literal sense.
Right. Right.
Because I didn't want to hurt others. And so, yes, that was a very, very hard time for me.
So what do you think, like looking back now, when you have a little bit more perspective, where do you think your life would be now if you hadn't taken the decision to make that transition? If you hadn't had the courage to say, I'm quitting my job and I'm selling my house and getting out of California, where do you think your life would be now if you hadn't had the courage to make that decision on transition?
My best guess is I would either be dead, disabled, or barely functional.
Wow. Wow.
I imagine I might have been able to improve some areas of my life. Eventually, we probably would have left California at some point. However, having experienced Austin some and seen it, how it's trended since 2018, I can say that would not have been an effective substitute.
A good environment for you.
No,
so it's interesting. So you said that, you would either be dead, disabled, or barely functional.
Yes.
Compared to a minute ago, you said, I look at my life and I find myself bursting with joy and bursting with enthusiasm. And I see that smile on your face now. And it's amazing. Something that could be that scary, literally blowing. And the words I used when you told me you're getting divorced and quitting your job is that blowing up your life. Like as I said, my brother Jim blew up his life.
Yes.
And I didn't know at that point that a few months later, 2 years later, I'd be blowing up my life. Maybe not quite as much, but it's really amazing to see the transition. And it's been such a joy to be part of. I'm so grateful to, the help that you've given me on my journey as well, to make, the big transitions that I'm in the process of making right now. But it's also been a great joy to see you play and to, mountain bike together and run together and hike together.
Yes, it's been so nice. So good.
And it's such a gift to me to have someone else, as I mentioned a while ago, that's, my age and that I'm so close to, that has time to be together. Right? Like most men of age, we're just completely still wrapped up in that program of busyness, right? And being significant.
Yes.
And then we don't have any time for each other. Like the last thing that comes up is friends. We make time for our job because that's the most important thing, especially in America. And then if we're lucky, we make time for some fitness and some family.
Yes.
But that's about it, so I'm really, really, really grateful for that, and having someone that I can talk to an hour a day, or we can go spend, whatever it was, 9 or 10 days in New Mexico together.
Yes.
For the second time this year.
You and me both, brother.
So I
want to throw something out also.
Absolutely.
Lest your listeners feel or get the impression that I have an idea of like perfect life. I definitely don't. I struggle with many things. And, one of them, which I'm so grateful that I've been able to struggle with this, is what am I doing next?
Right.
And as I've recently came to the conclusion, I'm going to go back to college and get a master's.
But it's not electrical engineering.
No, it is not. A master's of counseling, where I can perhaps leverage some of my own challenges and overcoming them in my life to help other people who are struggling. Now, I haven't been accepted at the school yet. I got to wait a few months to see when they make the decisions. But even if they don't accept me, I'll go somewhere else. Right. And I'll pursue this. At least that's the direction I'm heading now, and I feel good about that. It feels good to me.
So, Jim, can I ask you a question about that?
Of course.
Because it's one of the things I'm struggling with right now, right? And I have written down here, like, a future book title for me is, what does next actually look like? Right. And so I'm wondering, how did you make that decision? Like you quit your job. I never actually did get the date. When did you actually quit your job? You decided in the spring of 18.
I decided to leave. Actually, I decided to leave my job no matter what around June or July of 18.
Okay. In the summer of 18.
And I told my bosses that I was going to move to Austin around, late August.
Okay.
Late August of 2018. So you
gave them 2-3 months notice that you were leaving.
Yes. And as it worked out, they had a layoff coming up at the end of 2018. And I said, well, don't kick out one of the other team members, lay me off instead, because you're going to shoot yourself in the foot, because you're going to drop the team's bandwidth plus the guy who's running them. So maybe you can double up. And initially that was rejected. And my boss was in shock. And he was like, no, we can't lose you, Jim. I'm like, I reminded him, you're going to lose me anyway. I've made a decision. And you said you don't want to relocate the position to Austin. That's your decision. I'm not changing mine. So, so that was a kind of a, we'll wait and see, because they might have kept me on as the boss anyway.
Right.
But that made it official. It was also a little scary to even propose that, but it worked out. And
why was that scary? Just because being laid off is worse than quitting in your own mind, or?
Partly that, although that was the lesser part. The bigger part was I knew they didn't have anyone in mind to take my place.
Right.
And I also knew, since I had already been working 3 to 4 days from home every week, already, just to squeeze that extra hour, not in traffic, out of my 14, 15-hour days. And I kind of did it without permission. Between you and me, I didn't ask for permission. I just did it. But it worked out well. So I knew that I could, run things quite well remotely. And I knew that they were way behind and hadn't really moved to replace me. So,
but then it was really fair of you to say, that be really clear that you're leaving. So during the layoff, they could consider that and try to start planning.
And that's why it was scary, because I said I'm moving. I didn't say I'm leaving. And they said, we want the position to stay here, not in Austin, even though they have offices in Austin. And I said, okay, but I'm still moving. And I'm happy to stay on. Maybe you can change my title, or, I can take a new role or whatever, but I'm still moving. So my guess is, Art, between you and me, I guess not between you and me and anyone who's listening, my guess is that they probably would have kept me on at least for a while, and then working remotely, and then one of two things would have happened. They would have moved the position to Austin, or they would have replaced me. If they replaced me, they might have let me go, but more likely they would have reassigned me.
Right.
So volunteering to be laid off took a line in the sand and made it
Right.
reinforced concrete in a
Right.
sense. It's
Right.
like I'm volunteering to sever my relationship with this company that I've been with for 21 years.
Right.
That
Yeah,
was scary.
definitely. But it's also is probably better for you financially too, because if they lay you off, they also have to give you some severance along the way as well.
Yes, they did. That's true. And that didn't occur to me actually in the initial proposal. That's
Okay.
not why I made it.
Okay. Okay. But that's also maybe a one small one small demonstration of providence or God or universe, whatever you want to say,
That's
that
exactly what I was thinking.
that you made this decision without thinking of that because you felt like it was the right thing to do, because you were willing to say, I don't know what's next, but my life is unmanageable the way it is. My life is
Yes.
the way my life is. I'm literally going to die or be disabled or completely dysfunctional. So I'm stopping. And this seems like a good way to change the line in the sand to steel or concrete. And then once you had made that decision, then you realize you also get some severance as well, which is going to make the transition maybe a little bit easier financially.
Yes. And it did. And it has. Make no mistake. And yes, when I was telling you about this just now, it kind of hit me at the same time. It's like, wow, I guess that was one of the steps in my life that I started kind of around that time in my life of I'm going to do this no matter what and trust that the world will be okay, that I'll be taken care of, that things will be okay. At the time, I didn't really think of it that way. I just knew I needed to
Right.
move forward, to make a change.
So have you been able to, like, how much of the time are you able to stay in that place where you're trusting that you're going to be okay, that whatever happens, that you'll be okay, or that,
Well,
God or providence will take care of you,
that
that you'll
is
be
a
okay.
that is a never-ending struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. Me
It,
too.
it doesn't go away. If you're listening, Art just raised his hand. Um, so yeah, I mean, I struggle with this all the time. Um, Little things, big things. You know, my car starts making a funny noise. You know, I'm I'm like, well, we'll see where this goes. But not at first. At first, I'm like, oh crap,
Right.
it's gonna break down when I'm going up the mountain to get home.
Right. Start
Or
hyperventilating or frothing at the
or
brain, as I
yeah,
call it.
or I have these plans with people who are important to me, and I'm gonna, I'm gonna get it, break down or something. Little things, big things, things that are little but feel big, which is actually most things
Right.
that feel big. Um, I struggle with this. I guess I don't think about an existence that doesn't involve that struggle. However, I celebrate and express gratitude to myself and my journey and my progress for increasingly minimizing the time I spend struggling with things like this, with
Right.
unexpected things that enter my life.
Right.
And instead saying, okay, it's out of my hands. We'll see where it goes. Let's see what happens. I pulled a muscle in my back this summer, as you know, and as a result, my knee started hurting when I was running.
Right.
And so that's been deeply frustrating and has come up for me repeatedly again and again. And it's been a great opportunity for me to put this into practice and say, this feels bad. I was really starting to, get into my zone here, the performance zone
Right.
versus the training zone with my running. And I was looking forward to probably doing a half marathon this year for the first time ever. Um, and so that hasn't happened. I did manage to do that 10K, which was great. And my knee hurt like heck when I was
Right.
done. But I didn't injure it badly enough to be anything worse than I had already had. And again, it's just like, well, we'll see. I don't know why I needed to slow down. And I don't know if I will necessarily someday look back and see and understand why. However, I do trust there's a reason these things happened. This was I literally pulled that muscle in my back sitting on green grass working on a backyard project.
Right. Right.
And then I just turned to pick up a tool and my back muscle pulled.
Yeah.
That's 51 years old for you.
Yeah,
But
that's right. That's right.
but instead of letting that keep me down, I over and over again, as because running is part of my life now, you know, this comes up for me over and over again, and it's a great learning tool for me to accept it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
I
Yeah. No,
just I don't have to know what okay looks like. I don't have to know what it looks like in the future, but I can trust that there's a reason that it's happened. And let me frame it this way. Even if there's no reason at all and the universe doesn't give a damn, okay? If I suffer in my head thinking about it that way, I still lose. I whatever loss I experience from the injury is multiplied,
that's
perhaps many
right.
times over.
That's right.
And assuming that there could be or might be or is a reason this happened that is for the best in my future and my life, I mean, it allows me to just let it go
Yeah. And even if there's
and
not a
move
reason, like you
forward.
said, even if there's not a reason, the attitude, the leaning into us to thinking there is a reason allows us to make something out of it anyway. Right.
Yes, yes,
Between any stimulus and response, there's a
yes,
gap. And what do we want to put in that
right,
gap? Right. Do we want to put,
yes,
woe was me? God's mean to me. Life sucks.
yes,
Life happens to me. Even if it is, I mean, whether that's true or not, like the grand design of the universe, who knows? But the attitude, the approach
right.
of, I love Jen. I can't think of her last name. Shakiro. That you're a badass. Your sister's friend out in New Mexico.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Uh,
right.
I have her book, You're a Badass. And, I've always heard in Ephesians, I don't remember the verse, but there's, where God says, or it's not, God is talking about one of the apostles saying, be grateful and everything that happens, be grateful. And no matter what happens, give thanks. And I've always struggled with that a little bit. Like, what if something really bad happens? How are you going to give thanks for that? But in her book, she says, if you can't find something good in every situation, at least ask yourself, what could be good about this?
Right.
And I wrote that in Friday Reflections recently, because to me, if I'm having a situation that's really struggling and really sucks, it changes my mindset. It changes my outlook to say, what could be good? Maybe I can't say this is good, but what could be good? This
Yes.
property I'm wanting to buy
Hmm.
in Chattanooga right now, and it's not perked.
Yes. Yes.
Six months later, everything around it's all perked. And I could be getting frustrated, and I could be calling the guy and doing it the way I used to do it as a professional in a big multinational
Hard
company.
driving business guy. Yeah.
Make this happen. And instead I'm thinking, well, what could be good about this? Maybe what could be good about this is I'll start looking into properties to invest in the city like we wanted to do, and do
Hmm.
something to help
Hmm.
reclaim a rundown neighborhood in the city.
Right.
Right. Since I have that money left from selling the
I
farm. So
love that. I love that art because what could be good? I
yeah,
don't, I hadn't really
it's such an
framed it that way,
empowering,
but I think, yeah, I think I've been living that, but I had never framed it that way. And I love that framing.
because sometimes it's
What
too
could
hard
be
for
good?
me. It's too hard to say what is good about this. I don't know.
Yes, that is too hard. But
Like,
what could be is
but
a little
what could be
easier.
is like, it opens up the possibilities, right? So even if something's really intense, I say, what could be good about this? So I'm really grateful for that. And I see that in the way that you're living your life right now. And yeah, it's really a pleasure to talk with you, Jim. What if you were to sum up what you have learned in this transition? 2 sentences. What would it
Oh
be?
my God. I need about a year to come to distill that down.
I'll just go with what comes up first in your heart. What is it? What comes up?
We all have a heart
Mm-hmm.
and it talks to us. Many of us ignore, or I don't want to say ignore, many of us don't hear it because it's it's not our conscious mind. It's something subtle. For me, it manifests as a physical sensation in the pit of my stomach. And for anyone struggling with their life, I think an excellent place to start is to, if you have to set an alarm for once on the hour or at a specific time, many times a day, to just get in the habit of starting to check in with how does this feel in the pit of my stomach? Or if it's not in the pit of your stomach, I suspect most humans, at least, have some sensation that they can associate with what comes from their heart. What is to use an expression you've used and I've heard from others, a full body yes. So like no,
Aaron Katie. Yeah.
no, no reservations or
Right.
hesitations.
Right.
So if you can tune in to and get accustomed to listening and checking in with your heart about whatever. Should I go to the grocery store today or tomorrow morning? It doesn't have to be something
So no
big.
matter how mundane or ordinary it is
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So, Jim, I like to read Reader's Digest, so I'm going to see if I can put those 20 sentences into the 2 sentences for you and see if this, see if this works or not. So you said
right.
Everyone has a heart and it speaks to us and we need to listen.
Yes. That works given all I've said.
With the context.
Not everybody knows how to connect to their heart. I didn't know how to connect with my heart. That's why I expounded more, because I didn't know.
So how do you connect with your heart? What would you tell someone that's not good at connecting to their heart or hasn't experienced? I shouldn't say not good at it, but hasn't had that experience, like doesn't know how. What would you tell them?
Start by making an attempt to connect to it, period. Like that's why I said if it means setting an alarm on your phone or your watch or whatever for once an hour or once every 30 minutes or even 3 times a day or right before you go to bed or after breakfast or whatever, anything is a start.
So when you say start trying to connect with it, what does that look like? Just setting that alarm, and when that alarm goes off, what's the question that you ask yourself?
Yeah, for me, it is drawing my attention to the pit of my stomach. Like,
okay, so that's what it is.
I draw my attention inward into my body.
Okay.
And I feel like, put simply, there's tension versus relaxation.
Okay.
If it's a full body yes, if I have no reservations, or I don't even want to say full body yes, a full body okay, like
right. That there's no tension, there's no holding on to in your body.
There's that, yes, there's a relaxation, the relaxed feeling versus a stressed, tight feeling.
Right.
And for me, perhaps all my life until recently, I had a tight feeling in my gut, in my middle, all the time.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
However,
when did you discover, because like a fish in water, when did you discover that you had that feeling? Like, did you know it while you were having it for 25 years or 35 years or 45 years?
Not.
You didn't know it. So when did you notice that you had that feeling, that tightness, that knot in your stomach all the time?
It was probably, intermittently, even in the few years leading up to my major life changes in 2018.
So a couple times you noticed.
Yeah.
And if you had it all the time, how did you start to notice it? If it's there all the time, like how did you start to notice it?
Because there are degrees of tightness.
Okay.
So that's the one thing I've been waiting for a chance to say is, if you have this all the time, like I did, you may notice it all the time, or it's kind of like if you live underground in a lighted cavern your entire life, there's no sunrise, sunset. So you don't really think about or notice.
That's right.
Light.
That's
just right. Like our children don't know a world without the internet. It's just there.
Right.
You and I don't know a United States without the interstate highway system. It's just there.
Right.
We don't really think about it. We don't think about all the planning and effort and maintenance and upkeep and investment that it took to create that. It's just there.
All the bad habits and overstressing and workaholism that took to create anxiety.
That pit.
But the higher and lower levels of it is how you noticed it.
Yes.
So like if we're driving through rural Kansas or Oklahoma where there are no interstates, all of a sudden we notice, hey, this is what life is like without interstates.
Yes. And then you can start to, extrapolate from there and then, run a mental simulation about what it might look like in an extreme one way or the other. So yeah, when I started to notice the tension versus relaxation, at first it was a lot of tension versus less tension. At some point, even today, I still have that tension sometimes. However, I don't sit with it unawares for long.
Right.
Certainly, the longest I might go today would be an hour or two.
Right.
And whenever I become aware of this, I stop, at least mentally, I stop and I say, okay, where is this coming from? What's going on? And I usually don't have an answer. However, I start to ask myself questions. So could it be this thing I did, this thing I said, this thing I committed to, this thing I planned? How do I feel if I go back in my mind and change that decision?
Right.
Does that relax me? Does that release some of that tension? And I use that as a tool to help guide my life.
Right. Oh, that's great. I mean, that's great advice. I noticed, today I was talking with my sponsor in WA, and I noticed that this morning I noticed that I was feeling very relaxed, and that's how I knew I had been tense for the last week or something. Right.
Right?
Because it's the change. It's when I come down off of it, when I get back to my center, that I notice that I wasn't. On
Yes.
other
I'm
areas,
seeing
I
there.
can notice when I am while I'm in the midst of it, but in some areas I can't. And it's
Yes.
coming
It
down
is
off of it.
elusive.
And I think that's why it's so important to build in downtime and self-care and meditation and reading and Sabbath or whatever the method is, so that you have a chance to see the contrast and to be able to see clearly. Otherwise, it can be a treadmill that just keeps running and running, and we don't know it for a long time. Right.
Yes. And if my own transition is any guide for yours, Art, I can say with some level of confidence that as you become more and more accustomed to not being tense, your awareness of when you are increases.
Right.
So the
And that
further
makes
you go
sense.
down this path of transition to a life lived in harmony with your heart, it it be the relaxed state becomes the norm. And
Right.
so whenever you're out of it, it becomes more obvious. Um, so I talked about heart. I did want to just throw in one blurb about fear, though, because anyone who is able to, and I'm speaking this to myself here because I was able to do this to a degree, not 100%. Anyone able to learn to distinguish between tension from your heart, from something out of alignment with your heart, versus fear, that is life changing. It's monumental. I have a lot of fear about spending money to go get a master's degree.
Right.
It may affect my financial security that I what to the degree that I have it, and it's a big commitment. It's like, well, where am I going to reap the rewards of this investment? And but sitting with this idea, I sat with the idea of going back and getting a master's of counseling for a good 6 weeks before I decided that yes, I'm going to do it.
Right.
And I sat with it that long because of this fear. And then I was able to, on various days, in various moods, feeling various ways, to evaluate, is this fear or is this something not aligned with what I'm really okay with in my heart? And I concluded it was fear. And once I realized that it was just fear of my own personal financial insecurity, I was like, oh, well, then it's an easy decision.
Right. Right.
I never want my life to be run by fear again. I want to
Right.
use fear as a tool, as an advisor sitting on my shoulder to alert me to what I might want to keep an eye out for. However, I do not want it to be driving my life ever
Right.
again.
No, clear. Clear.
I'm going to repeat that. I'm going to repeat that. I do not want fear to drive my life ever again.
Right. Yeah, that's a big one. That's a big one. Right. And I think it's interesting. We're talking more about the Bible today than we thought we would, but the most common phrase in the whole Bible, I think it's 364 times, if I remember right, is fear not. Some version of fear not, do not be afraid.
Wow.
Right. It's the
I learned that today.
most common phrase in the Bible. So interesting. Well, Jim, it's been a real pleasure. And it's interesting. As much as I know you and as close as we are, I learned things I didn't know about you today. And that's really, it's really amazing. And it's really, I've had so much fun doing this. It makes me also think this is something that I'm glad I'm doing, because otherwise we wouldn't have had
Yes.
this chance to sit down in this way. And I'm guessing there'll be some more chances for us to
Yeah.
have a take
Whether
two,
they're,
take three on life and transition.
well,
Um,
if our past conversations are any indication, there will be many more similar conversations ahead, or related or ongoing. Whether you record them or not, that's up to you.
Right.
If
I
you
have
think
one
other
last question
people,
because I don't remember,
yes.
but we were talking when we first talked about doing this session. There was something that you shared. Do you remember? And you were like, "Holy crap!" Or I was like, "Holy crap!" Like there was some big aha, and I didn't write it down,
Well,
and I don't remember what it was. But I remember thinking at the time, dude, I wish I'd asked that question on the podcast because it would have been so much. Yeah, it would have been great to have that recorded. Do you remember what that was?
I'm not sure if I remember exactly, but I remember the gist of it. It's something like when you first said, I was thinking maybe if you're interested, maybe I could interview you for my podcast. And I had a big sort of almost like something I've been holding within me getting released. I was like, oh my God, Art, that's great because from the first moment you ever talked to me about having a podcast, I had this idea of I'd like to talk with Art on this podcast. I bet there's good stuff that can help other people that we can, that can come out from a conversation between us, because our conversations they're often really good.
Yeah, no,
They're
that's
not
true.
they're
And you
not
know what?
always this deep, but they're often
Yeah, no, they are
they
really
have
good. And
they
what's
are.
interesting is that I have this list of podcasts. Like I have 20 titles, and I've got 5 done, and 2 are launched. And if I followed that list, I would not be doing this right now. But instead, I've been trying to do what you were saying. Is every time I sit down, which isn't as often as I want to, because I come up against resistance, I come up against fear, and I let it win
Yes.
sometimes. But when I sit down and said, okay, and I try to tune in and listen to my heart, as you talked about, what is it? So 2 things. I started writing episode 14 when I only have 5 done, because that was a title that reached out to me. So I started writing
Uh-huh.
on a podcast that doesn't have a guest. That's episode 14. And then
Mhm.
the next day I'm like, okay, what is next for podcast? And I didn't pick back up 14, which I could have easily done and kept writing on that.
Mhm.
What is next? And I was like, oh, ask Jim to be a guest. He's been my coach as well as a lot of other people, but you've been my
Yes.
face-to-face, really time intensive, spending a lot of time together,
Yes.
walking partner for this part of the journey in an intense way, unlike the other coaches that I have by reading Arthur Brooks or David Brooks or, Richard
Right.
Rohr, these other, Joe Dispenza, all these other books that we talk and share about, but you've been the
Mhm.
one constant really in this space. And so it just like, because I was tuning into my heart instead of doing what I should and sort of follow the schedule, and here it is, my first podcast video recorded. That's a first, and also my first guest. So I really appreciate you being willing to do this and share so openly. I think there's a lot of nuggets that people can learn from this. And I'm just really grateful for this time together and really grateful for our journeys together, Jim. Love you lots, brother.
Dear brother. And likewise, I couldn't have said it better.
I can't wait to hear what action you are taking. Connect with me on LinkedIn or our website, lifeintransition.online, and let me know. Let a friend know too. It could be a huge encouragement to them and keep you on the track. Thank you so much for joining me today. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and it would mean a lot to me if you left a review and shared this episode with a friend. If you want to learn more about me and what I do when I'm not podcasting, please visit me at artblanchford.com. Thank you for listening. Together, let's make the most of life in transition.